In Chapter 5, we will talk about factoring polynomial expressions and equations. And in 5.1, we will start with the greatest common factor. Now, let's break this down. The greatest means bigger. Common means something that all the terms have in common. And factor, this means something that can divide. So we're looking for the largest expression that divides evenly into all the expressions of a polynomial. Now, how do you factor out the GCF? You write the greatest common factor on the outside of the parentheses. So the GCF is going to go on the outside. And then on the inside of the parentheses, you'll have, like different terms. So to figure out what remains inside, you divide each term by the GCF to determine what remains inside. The only way to really see this is to take a look at an example. So we have 24x squared plus 36x minus 18. We want to find the biggest number that can divide 24, 36, and 18. All right, so I'll give you guys some examples. Like I know that 2 can divide 24, 2 can divide 36, 2 can divide 18. So that is a common factor of 24, 36, and 18, but that's not the greatest common factor. Well, what about 4? 4 can divide 24, 4 can divide 36, 4 can divide 18. So that doesn't work because it's not a common factor. It doesn't divide 18. All right, what about 6? So 6 can divide 24. Okay, true. 6 can divide 36. 6 can divide 18. Okay, good. That's all true. Is there a bigger number than 6 that can do that? Like 12. 12 divides 24. 12 divides 36, but 12 does not divide 18. So 12 doesn't work. So 6 is going to be our GCF, or the greatest common factor. Now, what do we do with that? Well, we write the GCF on the outside of the parentheses. And what goes inside? Well, we're going to divide each term by the GCF, which is 6. Let me do it in a different color. So once you have your GCF, that goes on the outside. Now, to figure out what's left over inside, we divide each of these by 6. So 24 divided by 6 is going to be 4x squared. 36 divided by 6 is going to be 6x. And 18 divided by 6 is going to be 3. So this is our factored form. Now let's see if this is correct. So to determine if this is correct, we need to find out, we need to check our answer. Well, how do you check? You take 6 times 4x squared plus 6x minus 3, and we distribute. So we have 24x squared. 6 times 6 is going to be 36x, and 6 times negative 3 is going to be negative 18. And that's our factored, and that's our original expression. So because our factored form, when you multiply it, gives you our original expression, we know that we did it correctly. Let's take a look at our next one. We have 5x to the 5th, 10x to the 4th, and 25x cubed. So we have two things going on. We got the numbers. We have 5, 10, and 25. And we have to think about what is the biggest number that can divide all three of these. And that's going to be 5. 5 can divide 5, 5 can divide 10, 5 can divide 25. Now with the x's, we have 3 x's, here we have 4 x's, and here we have 5 x's. We have to think about the most number of x's that we can take out of each. Now this last one only has 3 x's. So we can't take out more than that since that last one only has 3 x's. So our greatest common factor for the variables is going to be x cubed. And with the variables, it's kind of easy because it's always going to be the smallest exponent. So GCF for variables, that's just going to be your smallest exponent. Okay, now, how do we know what's left over inside? So remember that whatever your GCF is, we are going to divide all three of these terms by that GCF. So we have 5 divided by 5 crosses out. Remember that when you divide the same base, if you have x to the 5th over x cubed, you keep the base and subtract the powers. So this gives you an x squared, and 5 divided by 5 is 1, so we just get an x squared. 10 divided by 5 is 2. X to the 4th divided by x cubed, same thing. We are going to keep the base and subtract the powers. So this will give you x to the 1st, which is x 25 divided by 5 is 5. X cubed cross out. So this is going to be the final answer. Now we can do a check to see if this is correct. If I multiply 5x cubed times x squared, and then 5x cubed times 2x, and then 5x cubed times 5. So basically I'm just distributing this back. When you multiply the same base, you add the power, so this gives you 5x to the 5th. 5 times 2 is 10. X cubed times x is x to the 4th. And 5 times 5 is 25, and we just have an x cubed. This is what we started off with. That's how we know that this is correct. The next one, factor out the greatest common factor. So we have 8y to the 8th and 10y to the 6th. Between 8 and 10, the biggest number that can divide those is 2. And with the variables, it's always going to be the smallest exponent. So our GCF is going to be 2y to the 6th. Now, how do you figure out what's left over inside? Well, I'm going to divide each of these by 2y to the 6th. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. And then if you divide the same base, we subtract the power. So this gives you 4y squared. And 10 divided by 2 is 5. Y to the 6th divided by y to the 6th, they cross out. And this is going to be the final answer. This next one, let's do this one in class. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the zero product property. The zero product property says that if two terms multiply to 0, so if a times b is equal to 0, then either a has to be 0 or b has to be 0, or they both have to be 0. Now what's the reason for this? Let's say I multiply two numbers, 5 times -5. It gives me a -25. If I multiply 5 times 1 over 5, it gives me 1 because the 5 and 5 cross out. The only way for two numbers to multiply to be 0 is if one of them is 0. And that's what the zero product property says. If two terms or three terms or however many multiply to 0, at least one of them has to be 0. So if we have x times x minus 8 equal to 0, then either x has to equal to 0 or x minus 8 has to equal to 0. Now x minus 0, the x is by itself, that's already solved. In the second case, you want to get the x by itself, so we are going to add 8 to both sides. And if I do that, I get x equals to 8. Okay, let's check to see if I did it correctly. If I did it correctly, if I plug in 0 or if I plug in 8, then on this left side it should equal to 0. So let me start with 0. If I plug in 0, I have 0 times 0 minus 8. And I want to know, does that equal to 0? So 0 minus 8 is -8, but 0 times anything is 0, so that checks out. Let's check the second one, which is x equal to 8. So if I check that, I have x is 8 times 8 minus 8, and I want to see, does that equal to 0? So 8 minus 8 is 0, and anything times 0 is 0, so that checks out. Now, to solve the next equation, x squared minus 5x equal to 0, before we can solve this equation, we have to have it in the factored form. The reason we have to have it in the factored form is the zero product property only works is if you have like a times b is equal to 0. So we have to get these factored. Now to factor, remember, we have to take out the GCF. We have to factor out the greatest common factor. So we have our two terms. We have x squared and we have a -5x. So the coefficient here is like an indivisible 1. Between 1 and 5, the greatest common factor is just a 1, so we don't have to write that. Between x squared and x, remember our greatest common factor with the variables at the one with the lowest exponent, so it's just going to be x. How do I know what's left over inside? I divide each of these by x. So x squared divided by x will just be x. And then x divided by x, those cross out, and that'll just be 5. So I have x times x minus 5, and that's equal to 0. Now that it's factored, I have the case where we have two terms multiplied to 0. So now I can apply the zero product property. We didn't have two terms multiplied to be 0 in the first case, which is why we have to factor it. Now by the zero product property, either x is equal to 0 or x minus 5 is equal to 0. So if I solve this, I get x equal to 0 or x equals to 5, and then this will be my solution. Lastly, I have m squared equal to negative 7m. For the zero product property to work, all the terms have to be on one side, and the other side has to be 0. So we're first going to move all the terms to one side. Because the other side has to be 0. Once we do that, then we're going to use the zero product property. So right now we have m squared minus 7m, m squared equals to negative 7m. And I want to get everything to one side. So to move the negative 7m, I'm going to do the opposite of it, which is a positive 7m. I'm going to add it to both sides. If I do that, I'm going to get m squared plus 7m is equal to 0. Okay, again, I want to get the right side to be 0, so the opposite of a negative 7 is positive 7m. So I added that to both sides, and I got one side equal to 0. Now I can factor this. They both have a common factor of m, so I have m times m plus 7 is equal to 0. Now according to the zero product property, either m has to equal to 0 or m plus 7 has to equal to 0. So one solution is already there, m equals to 0. If I solve this, I get m equal to negative 7. So this is going to be our solution. Okay, please come to class with any questions.